He was the son of an aviation pioneer and says he has always been drawn to that which is most difficult. Attracted to the military's competitive structure, he learned to fly because that was where the competition was keenest. He flew an F-86 Sabre jet in Korea and recorded 2 kills. He got his doctorate in space science from MIT. His dissertation laid out the basics of orbital rendezvous and made possible much of what man has accomplished in space. 15 years later, he used those same techniques to land on the moon and return safely to Earth. In the more than 30 years since his history-making flight, he has spent most of his time not looking back, but looking forward. And what he sees in the future may be every bit as important as what he accomplished in the past. He is Edward Eugene Buzz Aldrin, and he is a legend of air power. Edward Eugene Aldrin, Jr. was born on January 20th, 1930 in Montclair, New Jersey. His mother, Marion, was the daughter of an Army chaplain. His father was a student of rocket pioneer Robert Goddard and an aide of legendary pilot and gadfly Billy Mitchell. Aldrin had 2 sisters who couldn't pronounce the word brother. They said instead, Buzzer, and the nickname stuck.
And then I went away to summer camp in Maine, starting when I was 9 years old, and I continued to go there for 2 months of every summer until I was 16. And that really taught me a lot about competitiveness and teamwork and camaraderie. And I give a lot of credit to that particular summer camp in Maine.
He was also very much the product of a sometimes stormy relationship with his father, Edward Sr. He was a brilliant man who expected much of his son. Buzz, gifted in his own right, felt that pressure nearly every day of his life.
Clearly, he loved his father a great deal. Clearly, at the same time, the father gave him expectations of performance that he felt difficult to meet. He was basically an individual who was constantly raised to believe that you had to be number one all the time and everything. And that caused him some challenges.
Buzz graduated 3rd in his class at West Point, went to flight school in San Antonio, and was one of the elite pilots tapped to fly fighters. In 1953, he went to Korea. He flew 66 combat missions in F-86s and shot down 2 MiG-15.
You know, a lot of people ask about spaceflight, if we're afraid or scared or fearful. It's no comparison to being in combat, where everything is unknown.
After returning from Korea, he worked his way earnestly through his Air Force career. He taught combat gunnery to new pilots, was an aide to the Dean of Faculty at the Air Force Academy, and flew F-100s in Germany. He and his partner, future astronaut Ed White, were such crack shots in the air that they represented their squadron in the annual NATO gunnery competition. In the late 1950s, everything in aeronautics was coming up space. A new word, astronaut, entered the vocabulary, and the first generation of American spacemen was recruited from the ranks of test pilots, most of whom were based at Edwards Air Force Base in California. As the Air Force tinkered with different experimental flight platforms, the Guggenheim Foundation, one of the leading charitable trusts in the world, endowed a series of academic chairs and programs designed to build scientific understanding of the basics of spaceflight. Aldrin, lacking a background in flight test, chose academics as his road to space. He applied for admission to MIT, his father's alma mater, and perhaps the most demanding engineering school in the world. He became one of the first students in the Guggenheim-created astronautics program, and was hard at his calculus in 1961 when President Kennedy announced that the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
A year later, as John Glenn orbited high above the Earth, Aldrin laid down the theoretical basis for orbital rendezvous.
I chose a different career path. I put more emphasis on professional education. That's what my father had done, and that's what other people had done. Somehow, with the tour of combat in Korea and then the other assignments, it just didn't occur to me that I wanted my career to be dependent upon my coordinated skills as a pilot. I wanted it to be more relying on my professional knowledge and creativity. And fortunately, I chose the route that I think suited me fine, and the timing turned out to be just almost perfect.
After graduating MIT, Aldrin went to work in the Air Force Space Office. He was doing work to support the second group of astronauts, the Project Gemini astronauts, when NASA decided that all astronauts did not have to be test pilots. With his sparkling combat record and his PhD in astronautics, it was no surprise to anyone when in late 1963, Aldrin became a member of NASA's third astronaut class. Aldrin soon discovered, however, that while the outside world now saw him as a member of an elite, inside NASA, he was one of many second-class citizens. The NASA Aldrin joined was dominated by Mercury astronauts, many of whom openly scorned the kind of academic credentials Aldrin wore with such pride. He could be an astronaut, yes, but because he wasn't a test pilot, he wasn't going to be allowed to command a mission. That was an honor reserved for the test pilots, and it was a distinction that changed Aldrin's life. The astronauts of Project Mercury sometimes felt as much like lab animals as they did pilots. Their training had as much to do with medical research as it did aviation. They were probed and poked in every conceivable way as researchers documented their physical and mental conditions before and after their brief space flights. Project Gemini, the second American space initiative, had less to do with basic medical understanding and more to do with actual operations in flight. Gemini tested the fundamentals that would be necessary to accomplish a mission to the moon and back: the ability of a spacecraft to rendezvous and dock with another, and the ability of astronauts to leave the capsule and walk in space. Buzz Aldrin entered NASA with the third astronaut class, recruited and trained specifically with the moon landings in mind. He was, arguably, the first of a new kind of astronaut. While his flight credentials were impressive, it was his background as a scientist and engineer that made him most interesting to NASA. The Mercury astronauts flew alone, clearly requiring each to be an accomplished pilot, comfortable with the unknown. Project Gemini, however, flew with a crew of 2, and Apollo would fly with 3 on board. The days of the dominance of test pilots in the astronaut corps, like it or not, were coming to an end. The days of the mission specialist, space-traveling scientists and engineers who might know little of flight, were dawning. Aldrin threw himself into training and planning. He passed his doctoral dissertation around among NASA scientists, and as a result, changes were made in the procedures for the first docking maneuver. The first Gemini craft to go into space, Gemini 3, tested the ability of a spacecraft to change its orbital path. Aldrin's former gunnery partner, Ed White, tumbled through the first American spacewalk during the flight of Gemini 4. Aldrin helped revise the procedures for walking in space. He designed a system of handholds and rails that allowed astronauts to move effectively outside the capsule.
Spacewalking, we had some problems initially in spacewalking, and I came along at just the right time to be able to train underwater in neutral buoyancy for my Gemini 12 flight.
Gemini 12 lifted off November 1966. Once in orbit, Aldrin conducted what was then the longest spacewalk in history, more than 5 hours. He did not spin out of control as earlier astronauts had. and accomplished everything he set out to accomplish. He returned, as all astronauts did in those days, a hero. And then he did what all astronauts also did. He got back in line to await his next assignment. More than ever, in the tiny and competitive community of astronauts, all eyes were on the crew selection process. Not only did everyone want another flight, but some member of the small working group of flyers inside NASA was going to the moon.
There was a lot of wondering. I wouldn't really call it jockeying around. I'm sure that some people felt they had better access to the selection process that was pretty much determined by the two people in the Mercury program, Alan Shepard in charge of the astronaut office as the chief astronaut office, and Deke Slayton, who was grounded, and he was in charge of flight crew operations. So those two people essentially selected the sequence of crews.
Aldrin fretted his own belief that his lack of a flight test background would hurt his chances of being chosen. His extraordinary work, however, landed him a job as backup crew for Apollo 8, the second Apollo mission into space. Apollo 8's mission was to leave Earth orbit, circle the moon at the same altitude an airliner circles the Earth, and return. The flight tested NASA's deep space tracking system and the ability of the mission's computers to calculate trajectory and rocket burns at a distance of 250,000 miles.
It was really a very challenging and very intriguing mission to be on the backup crew. If we lost communications, then we would have to navigate with the sextant. And it was very tedious, making many, many measurements of the angle between star and moon horizon, or the star and Earth horizon.
The mission went off without a hitch. Both the deep space tracking system and the manual navigation procedures worked perfectly. Mission Control celebrated the technical achievement in which Aldrin had played a crucial role. The moon was almost literally getting closer. To this day, Apollo veterans downplay the competition to get on the moonshot, but there is no doubt that it was very real. Apollo 9's crew was already training for the first flight of a lunar module. Apollo 10's crew prepared to take both the command and lunar modules around the moon and to descend so close to the surface it seemed that they could almost touch it. Astronauts not directly involved in those missions went to work on the details of Apollo 11, which, if all went well, would land the first men on the moon. Aldrin and fellow astronaut Jack Schmitt assembled one of the first mission timelines, a minute-by-minute checklist of what needed to be done to get safely to the moon and back. They added an emergency takeoff countdown immediately after the lunar module landed on the moon's surface. And when it came time to decide which of the two astronauts on the moon's surface would come out first, Aldrin penciled in the second in command. It was a logical choice based on procedures during Gemini's spacewalks. The commander stayed on board, and the junior man left the capsule.
So there were precedents that would lead one to think that the very severe training workload required of the commander for the launch from the surface of the Earth, for the en route decisions, for the landing itself, and then the liftoff from the moon were all very intense requirements for training that only the commander went through in great detail. So to then have him be the person who was doing more activities on the surface, there was an argument that said it might be better to have the junior person do more of the activities out on the surface.
Aldrin made that argument not entirely from an academic standpoint. As a member of the backup crew for Apollo 8, he knew that the standard rotation sequence would make him a member of the Apollo 11 crew. Privately, Aldrin also guessed that Mission Command would stay with one of the test pilot elite. By following Gemini precedent and designing the mission so that the junior man became the first man on the moon, he was in effect putting himself at the head of the line. 6 weeks before Apollo 11 took off, NASA made its decision. Neil Armstrong, The mission commander would walk first on the moon. Aldrin would follow. The decision was based on two things: the position of the astronauts inside the lunar module and public relations. Armstrong, as LEM pilot, was closer to the door, and NASA administrators understood what those in the cloistered astronaut corps did not. The first man on the moon would become the space age's Charles Lindbergh. Having that be the mission's junior man, they reasoned, just wouldn't be right. In the late 1960s, it seemed as if the world was coming apart. Historic social upheavals, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the sexual revolution were changing almost every aspect of daily life. In Africa and Asia, colonialism breathed its last violent gasp. The Cold War raged worldwide, and the hot war in Vietnam caused civil war in the American streets. But on July 16, 1969, the whole world stopped to watch the crew of Apollo 11 walk out to the truck that transported them to a launching pad. As a handful of people must have watched Christopher Columbus sail over the horizon to the New World, hundreds of millions watched Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins climb into the biggest rocket man had ever built for their trip to the moon. It was an extraordinary moment that was almost completely lost on those at its epicenter.
In spaceflight, except during the launch, usually things are happening quite slowly, and there's so much attention that's been paid to exercising over and over again all of the normal procedures and then concentrating on as many of the emergency procedures as you possibly can. So you feel quite confident that you know what to do in spaceflight, and there isn't a concern for having a clouded mind that fear brings on.
For 4 days, the world watched as the Apollo 11 crew worked its way down the meticulously assembled checklist and onto the moon. NASA fed the public's hunger with a seemingly endless stream of details about what the astronauts were eating, what they were thinking, and what they were doing. Behind the scenes, however, there was grave concern that the mission would fail. NASA Administrator Tom Paine told the crew of Apollo 11 that if anything went wrong, they should get home safe, and he'd guarantee that they would be on the next flight, their chance for immortality preserved. It was a guarantee he couldn't deliver on, but he hoped that it would keep the crew of Apollo 11 from taking unnecessary risks. In the White House, William Safire drafted the speech that President Nixon would give if Aldrin and Armstrong were stranded on the lunar surface. In their exploration, Safire wrote, they stirred the lives of people of the world to feel as one. In their sacrifice, they bind more tightly the brotherhood of man. On July 20th, Aldrin and Armstrong crawled through the narrow passageway into the lunar module. They pushed all the right buttons, went through all the well-rehearsed procedures, and began their descent to the surface of the moon. The LEM, which was named Eagle, was an early model that weighed more than the refined models to follow. During the descent, its cockpit filled with the sound of alarms warning that it was coming down too fast. At 500 feet, Armstrong took manual control of the craft, maneuvering around a crater and boulders in search of a smooth landing spot. At 100 feet, Aldrin noted that they were down to only 60 seconds of fuel. They touched down with 15 seconds of fuel remaining.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
While the whole world breathed a sigh of relief, Aldrin and Armstrong continued their checklist. They prepared for an emergency launch. They checked their craft for damage. And Aldrin did something that NASA had approved ahead of time, but had asked that he keep to himself. He served himself communion on the surface of the moon. Some hours later, Aldrin watched as Armstrong descended the ladder to the lunar surface. A few minutes later, Aldrin stepped out into the glaring sunshine. And that's when the fun began. Operating in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, Aldrin bounced back and forth in front of the television camera, He bounced forward and back, jumped and hopped, and did everything a little kid might do. Though it looked to everyone in the world as if he was just playing, to this day Aldrin insists he was demonstrating different mobility techniques for the scientists at NASA. Aldrin and Armstrong didn't stay long on the surface of the moon. 21 hours after the Eagle landed, it took off again. Aldrin and Armstrong rendezvoused with Michael Collins in the command module, discarded the Eagle, and headed home. By any standard, he was a deserving hero. He had fought and won in aerial combat. He had excelled academically at one of the most demanding institutions of higher learning in the world. He had become an astronaut, and from that outstanding corps was chosen to be on the first lunar mission. He and his fellow crew members executed their mission flawlessly, and upon their return, behaved with grace and dignity. But for Aldrin, always his most demanding critic, being the second man on the moon was somehow not enough.
I think this came to a head in many ways in the early 1970s after he returned from the moon. This was something where he had been on the first lunar mission, a mission of extraordinary accomplishment and extraordinary importance, and yet he had a sense, I think, of self-doubt and a confusion over a sense of self-worth, if you read that memoir, because he hadn't, in fact, been the mission commander. He had been the second man to land on the moon, and that was very unfortunate and very sad.
Aldrin is, those who know him agree, still on a quest to prove his worth. While most of his fellow astronauts have retired to become professional speakers about the good old days, Aldrin has continued to push forward. As he once provided the theoretical basis for orbital rendezvous, he has recently developed a gravity-based model of interplanetary flight that would, if implemented, vastly decrease the cost of moving heavy loads from Earth to Mars and back.
I've moved from orbits around the Earth or around the moon to now using that gut feeling, that seat-of-the-pants approach, to look at orbits between Earth and Mars, cycling orbits that go around the sun and swing by the Earth with gravity assist that then results in a swing by of Mars and comes back to Earth again.
He worries that the public's fascination with spaceflight has faded and has proposed that NASA conduct a lottery with the winner traveling into orbit. When he speaks of space, it is not in the romantic language of the aesthetics of flight, but in much harder and more important technical and economic terms. He envisions a future where ships carrying hundreds of people lift into space. Those ships, he says, will launch one day, as hundreds of ships followed Columbus to the New World. And when they go, he hopes that their journey will have been made easier by his hard work and commitment to understanding the unknown.